Thanks very much, and thanks very much, Content is Queen, for having me here today, and good afternoon to everyone. Thanks for joining me in this session. So you are in the Is It Legal session, which I guess is great once you've done your whole podcast, you've got it it's about to sort of hit release, and well, hopefully before that you'll be confident that it's all legal. But yeah, this is a really practical, I think, session that I'm going to go through. So just a little introduction. I am a freelance media content lawyer. I've worked as a media content lawyer for about 10 years, but I've been 15 years in the industry. I've mainly worked in TV prior to going freelance just last year, so still finding my feet, but I was employed by mainly in-house media companies. I've worked at Discovery, Disney. I worked for Ofcom, the regulator, and I spent sort of 8 years working in Channel 4's legal team as well, making quite a lot of edgy content and advising quite a lot of edgy content there. And of course, the last few years I've done mainly a lot of TV work, everything from reality to news, to your scripted, so a whole load of genres. And of course, I've been advising a lot on podcasts and the last few years, which has been great for me because I personally love podcasts, which is obviously why I'm here as well. One of the places I work is Paper and Chain, which was set up by Melissa Fish, and she's a fantastic woman, experienced media lawyer as well. And they offer really good kind of an affordable, because I know how sometimes lawyers are not the cheapest, but they're quite budget kind of friendly as well. So there's the plug for Paper and Chain and Melissa Fish, who sadly couldn't be here today. So I will jump straight into this talk. So this is really looking at your content concerns rather than all the more business affairs, negotiations sort of thing. So things like defamation, copyright, contempt of court, privacy, and some ethical issues as well. I don't know if there are any journalists or people working in journalism that are here. Okay, so you'll probably be very familiar with, don't worry, I wasn't going to get you up, but you'll be journalists. You'll be very, very familiar with libel and privacy and contempt, so hopefully this is a bit of a refresher. But if not, one thing I'd like to say is sometimes when I do these sort of talks, people start panicking and thinking, oh my God, X, Y, Z. The first thing I'd say is, this really is about just giving you a bit of a guide, a bit of how to think about certain issues as they come up. And of course, wouldn't be a legal talk without a disclaimer. So here is my disclaimer. One thing I know from talking to people is they say, lawyers always say it depends, or we don't know, and they won't give you a straight answer. I probably won't give you a straight answer either, but I can give you some guidance. So that is my promise to you. This talk is based on the laws of England and Wales, because that's what I'm qualified in. I know that quite a lot of people do podcasts, particularly if you're doing them for the bigger kind of platforms. They'll say, but we need international kind of clearance. And what I'd say is, depending on the content that you're doing, quite a lot of this will still be relevant. So for the instance, when we get to copyright and I start talking about fair dealing, which is the UK defence, fair use is the US defence, and to be honest, they're really quite similar, and it's very, very similar in Europe. So it's not time that's not sort of well spent if you're thinking, this is great for UK, but I've got to get international. So that's that. Okay, I'm going to jump straight in. So copyright, which is something you'll be familiar with, but in the context of, here's a few little reminders about copyright. No copyright in ideas, news, facts. So if somebody brings up a news story or a fact, there's no copyright in that fact. It's just the way that it's expressed. So just a little reminder there. Usually the copyright of an author expires about 70 years after the creator of the work dies. You don't need to register copyright, it automatically exists. So it's a bit different to your trademarks and your patents and things. So the moment you do something, this presentation, which you may not think much of, but if someone wanted to copy it, I don't have to say it's mine or put copyright Sophie Argent, Sandhya Sophie Argent. It exists anyway. So incidental inclusion of copyright work. I was thinking of an example for this, if I've come across this in podcasting, and not much, to be honest, because you rely so much on there being really good sound quality that you don't often want to have background noises or background things going on. But if really, you know, you're interviewing a contributor, I don't know, let's say you're doing this, and somebody goes past in a car with music blaring, you don't have to go around and try and clear that music because it was incidental. You didn't really have control over it. So that's incidental. If it comes up, it hasn't really come up, as I say, in podcasts. It comes up quite a lot in TV and other forms. But it's there if you ever need it. And we're on to your fair dealing defence. This piece, this sort of idea, have you ever heard of fair dealing or fair use? Yeah, great. So I'm not sort of sitting there talking to people really confused. I don't. You don't. Wonderful. You will hear all about it now. Fair dealing is a really, really great defence in copyright law. And I have to say, again, with caveats and disclaimers, if you're doing making podcasts for, you know, the Acasts, the Spotifys, the Audibles, all of those, you're always going to have to talk to them about if they're happy with you fair dealing, because the general rule is you need to get all the licenses and all the clearances. But if, for instance, you are wanting to include a piece of, I don't know, a news report or a TV program, or refer to, I don't know, a book, or quote something, or even a piece of music, and you haven't been able to license it, let's say, you can often use fair dealing. So that means you don't have to go and get a license, you don't have to go to the license holder. What fair dealing means is you can use a little bit of it, so a bit of a song, and as long as you talk about it, and you talk about it very specifically, and you're only using what you need to make your point, and you give an acknowledgement, so you might say, you know, this song by whoever sung it, and you talk a little bit about it, you can probably use fair dealing. But, because there's always a but with these defences, you can't use it for budgetary reasons. So certainly don't use it to say, I know it can save money, but that mustn't be your reason for using fair dealing. So you can't use it for budgetary reasons, and you must always only use the amount that you need, because you shouldn't really be ripping off whole pieces of copyright, a whole song, and then saying, here you go, we've used it for criticism and review. So that's your fair dealing defence. We also in the UK have, in the last few years, got a parody defence. So you use an existing work, but then you kind of make it comedic, or you add another kind of quality to it, and that makes it a parody. So that's also great, so you don't have to get permission. Hi.
So just to clarify, if you were, say, a music podcast and you spoke for 15 minutes about the latest new single, you couldn't play the whole single?
You would have to justify, because for fair dealing, it's using a fair amount, because what you've got to think about is you've got to think about the copyright owner that owns that song, or the publishing company, and what they're going to say is, well, that's great, but I should have really been licensed or paid for all of that. And it's a bit competitive, if you see what I mean, because it's sort of like playing a whole song, but only saying maybe a few lines of it may be seen as a bit much, because why do you need the whole song? Do you see what I mean? That doesn't mean, so I hear a lot of rumours whenever you're doing legal talks, and someone said, oh, if you only use apparently 8 seconds, you can do this. I don't know where they come from. I think they come from different things. My advice is always, use what you need, but just always have a little bit of thought to the fact that, do you really need all that amount? Unless you're saying something very different about every single verse, every single line, every single piece of music, then I think it'd be really hard to justify and to say, yeah, we needed the whole song in order to make this criticism and review point, basically. That's what I'd say. No problem. Yeah, do jump in with questions, because this is kind of your session as well, to be honest, although I'll leave some time at the end. But I would say fair dealing is your friend. It really is. Hi.
Hi. At the risk of asking like a very similar
You
follow-up
can ask.
question.
Yep.
So say you were doing like a TV recap podcast.
Yep.
And so you're chatting about Friends. So you have your own intro song, you chat for 10 minutes, you play 3 minutes of the episode because you're like, oh, we're talking about season 3, episode 7, cool, fine. You talk about that 3 minutes, you talk about other things without playing the episode, and then you return to the same episode, steal another 5 minutes from somewhere else, steal another 4 minutes from here and there. Does that continue to be fair dealing? And is it different if you steal something quote unquote iconic? So if you steal Ross and Rachel screaming, we're on a break, is that worse than just stealing Monica being
I get you.
neurotic?
I get it. I completely get it. Well, I've got good news for you. I mean, there are two ways. So that "we are on a break" is also quotation. So you can always use a short quote. That's fine. What I would say is, you're talking about risk, I guess, risk levels. And I would say don't be shy of using those really hit copyrighted type of works. Yes, those people are often going to have the money to come for you. But what I say is, that's why you need to be sure you've got your robust defense. So yes, I've only used what I've needed to. I've done a line over it, or the whole podcast is about reviewing iconic shows from the 90s or certain episodes. So I've got an element of criticism and review in this. And I've acknowledged it. I've said, this Friends episode, this iconic Friends episode. So if you can do that, and also you've accessed it in a kind of fair way. By that I mean, you've got it from a legitimate source. It's an open source kind of material, rather, because sometimes what happens is you go to license material, or someone sends you a press screening. And then you say, yeah, great, now I'm going to use this material to fair deal. But that's not actually the basis on which you were given that material. You were just given that material to have a look at it, not to use it then in your... So that's another point about fair dealing, is the way that you access material has to be fair, not in breach of confidence or breach of commercial agreements. Get it from open source materials, whether that's buying the book yourself, whether that's from, openly available platforms, YouTube, Facebook, what have you. You can't use works that haven't been obviously published. Hi.
What if you use your technological know-how to rip something off, like to make a recording from it's source on the internet? Sorry. What if you use your technological know-how to make a recording from a source on the internet that, probably doesn't want you to take that recording, but you're using it in a fair dealing way?
Yeah, again, it comes to accessing things fairly, so it depends how you're doing it. I mean, I don't think I necessarily like the term ripping off. What I would say is, and perhaps I'd, we might want to have a chat about that maybe later, but I would just say always access things in a fair way. Openly available sources is what I would say.
Just to confirm, because you said YouTube.
Yes.
When you say YouTube, you mean uploads that have been uploaded by the content creator, and not stuff that has been copied illegally, then uploaded. So if it's a creator that has uploaded to a content platform,
yes,
that's fair. But if somebody's uploaded the latest episode of Top Gear, for example, or something, illegally,
yes, absolutely. No, and that's a really good point as well, because even when you're licensing material, we have this term in the industry we call best endeavours, or await claims sometimes, because sometimes it's also, one is, your point is very valid, so you can't, the whole point of fair dealing is you have to access content in a fair way, but also you have to acknowledge who the copyright owner is, and sometimes the person that uploads it isn't actually the copyright owner for a start, so that means it's really hard to fair deal because, as I say, the point of fair dealing is you at least acknowledge the copyright holder. And sometimes you might be in a situation where you want to license some material, but you have no idea, Joe Blogs 84 has uploaded it, that's the uploader, but you have absolutely not a Scooby-Doo who the copyright owner is. So you just try and keep a log of your best endeavours to try and find them. Hello?
My voice will be loud enough.
Okay, let's go.
Hi, just
Hi.
in terms of, so let's say downloading, I work in podcasts, but also like live radio.
Okay.
So at times we may use our phone and use the iPhone to almost screen grab to record something from Netflix. Does that come into, we do get sort of cleared for BBC and that, but I'm just checking for doing podcasts and that. Does that also go into fair dealing, and have we got it the right way as such?
Yeah, it depends what you're going to do with that kind of photograph and the way in which you were accessing the Netflix. So, if you're accessing it the right way, you've just put it on and you've got a requisite account and whatever. But I guess I'm not sure what you would do with the screen grab. Are you then?
When I say screen grab, I mean just so on iPhone you can video. So you can video pieces. So on Netflix, I would video. Let's say I don't know, I'm interviewing someone from Top Boy or something. If there's a certain clip that we want to discuss with him, sometimes the publicist etc. can't send us the thing in time, so we'll go on Netflix and just take 15 seconds or however needs to make the point.
To make the point.
To put
That's
it into
great. Yeah.
So from Netflix, that those elements.
Yeah, it
fine.
sounds like you would be able to do that, because you've accessed it in a fair and legitimate way. You're using criticism and review because you're going to be talking about it, about the latest series of Top Boy. And again, you're using what you need and you're crediting it. So the whoever the producers are and you obviously say it's Netflix. Cool. Then it sounds like you're in fair dealing territory.
One last
thing.
Go for it. If you're not specifically critiquing it, so you just want to give a bit of, body
Flavour.
or add. Yeah, there you go. So for example, this actor, the last thing that he worked in was such and such.
Yes.
That's also.
That's establishing.
Yeah. Okay.
Establishing. So it doesn't have to be, this kind of listy type of filmy. When we say critique and review, sometimes it makes people sound like they've got to do some dissertation or high-minded thing. It's not that. You just have to justify the relevance. So last in the groundbreaking or award-winning Netflix, and you have a little excerpt of it. That's fine. But yeah, don't use like an hour program and then say, oh yeah, that's great. But yeah, if you do that, you're in that territory. So the next one I'm going to go on to is really topical, which is libel, which the last few weeks you'd have to really be hiding to not hear about defamation and defamation cases. But it happens. You'll be familiar with defamation, hopefully, or if you're not, you're about to be. So this happens a lot in podcasts where you've got either you're saying something, or quite often in my experience, it's your contributors. So your contributors will be having really great autobiographical detail about their life or a company they've got or whatever. And then they will drop in something about someone, and all of a sudden you've got a potential libel issue on your hands. The good news is there's really great defences, so I'll start with them first. If you can justify or if you can corroborate that a comment made that's defamatory is truth, then you're home dry, because it's a complete defence, basically, truth. And other defences do apply, but these are the two really relevant ones, I think, to you. Honest opinion, somebody giving an opinion about something that factually happened, you're often going to be covered as well. So that's your two defences. So always keep that in mind if you've got either a contributor or you're saying something that might be potentially defamatory about a living person or a trading company. I won't repeat any examples here, but you'll get what I'm saying. I think an important thing to say is about the meaning. So when I have a lot of conversations with producers or journalists or whatever, they'll say, yeah, but it's not a hatchet job what I'm doing, or I'm not meaning to go around libeling this person. But ultimately, the way defamation works, it's not about what you intended. It's when people hear your podcast, what do they take from it? And did they take something defamatory from it? So you have to be a little bit objective, hence why quite often I'm the person brought in to read your scripts or to have a little bit of a check to see if there's something defamatory. And if there is, we'll then discuss it and see if we've got those defences. It applies to these sort of inspired dramas and dramas inspired on real events as well. So if you're making podcasts like that, you can't just say, yes, it's inspired, but we've changed all the names and everything, so we're home dry. No, if someone thinks that it's based on an actual living person, then you could be in defamation libel territory as well. A couple of things. I mean, a great way to, if somebody said something and no one's talked about this in a press, say they say something about a company or a person, very famous person, and no one's spoken about it, you'll really want to do, I'm coming out of time, aren't I? No, you're fine. Okay. If they're about to, and you have no idea, you've got no way what the subject of this allegation has said or what their response is, a really good thing to do is a right to reply. Right to reply sounds incredibly formal, incredibly scary and terrifying, but a right to reply can sometimes be an email to a subject or a phone call, or you could include that person in your podcast if they were willing to do it. But the good thing about a right to reply is it demonstrates responsible journalism. You haven't just taken what you've read or what another contributor said in your podcast and taken it for granted. You've actually gone to the subject of those allegations and just asked them for their view.
Is there a guideline around the time frame you should allow people for a right to reply, particularly given recent legal events?
Yeah, good question. I mean, look, I've worked in news, and if something's really urgent, sometimes people have given 24 hours. I've also just worked on and it, again, depends. I told you I was going to say depends. There's nothing in law that says, in things like television, because it's regulated by Ofcom, they will say a reasonable time, which is very useful. I generally, my personal view is, it does really depend on who the subject of the allegation is. If it's very, very newsworthy and they're already talking about it, and some of these places have lots of big PR teams around them, then they might need less time because it's something they're already knowing about. If it's something really extensive and you've done a whole big investigation about something, it's just fair, isn't it, to maybe give a week or two. So I would say like a week, if it's something really complicated, a week, maybe 10 days is a ballpark. But there's nothing in law that tells you must give X amount of time. It's going to be governed by what the allegations are, what the subject matter is, who the subject is.
So I'm not actually sure which, because some of us don't necessarily follow the news or social media because protect stuff from mental health. So I'm not sure where is it.
I need to get there as well.
I don't know if it's the Amber Heard, Johnny Depp thing you guys are talking about. That's the only thing I'm thinking of. Okay, right.
Yeah.
But I guess like what I would ask is like, I would say like, for example, would it be okay? Because sometimes like I've covered something that was quite public story, but more like a niche because it's within like self-help development. And I have actually sort of divulged at the start saying, just to let you know, I haven't actually asked, because it's kind of a big name anyway, so I haven't actually, that person hasn't had the opportunity to reply. I haven't reached out, so this is just from the victim's family.
Yes.
Would that be sort of enough? I mean, I'm not worried about if they want to come for me, it's fine, but like, I don't think they will, because they don't,
won't come for you.
to be honest, I don't know.
It's a brilliant, I think that all helps, because it helps give, I've said that to sometimes people. Sometimes you can also reach out and you give a right to reply and the person's not bothered. They haven't even come back. Sometimes they come back with a legal letter. But sometimes they come back or they don't come back. And at least, one, you can demonstrate that you've thought, I've gone to them. Or secondly, you just give information. I haven't reached out to the person, so it is this sort of only one side. All I'd say with that, though, is that make sure what you are telling from a particular victim's perspective can be kind of corroborated. You know, you can think, you know, if it's something that happened and it was a crime, you know, this person was convicted, or you get a lot of information from your contributors, you know, I have a police letter, or there's this email, and at least you feel like, okay, I haven't just relied on somebody telling me something, because that's where the danger often is. You know, what's your motivation? Unfortunately, to kind of take a little bit sensitive, but, you know, have done quite a few podcasts, true crime podcasts, and podcasts with people revealing sensitive issues for the very first time. And sometimes it can be that the person has a bit of an axe to grind. So this isn't, by the way, any type of victim blaming. It's just being very objective. And I know you always have to be very careful with how you have conversations with contributors. But sometimes it's more a case of, actually, I don't want this contributor to get into any issues because of something they've said on a podcast. So I want to feel like they're in a good place, and I am going to talk about welfare in a moment because I think it's important. One, they're in a good place, but two, worst case scenario, and you know a lawyer loves a worst case scenario, but worst case scenario, if it went to court, what have we got? What have we got to rely on, you know? And so it's not just about protecting you, it's about protecting the people that have been vulnerable enough to share what they're going through. And the consequences for them, you know, people saying to people, I will get onto that in a moment, but saying to people, you know, if they're still in a job or if they're a whistleblower, thinking about what the implications are for them. You might have protections as someone that's a publisher and doing certain things, but they may not have protections. And so you really want to find out for them as much as for you as well. But I could talk about, as you think, I could probably talk about libel and getting around this, but that's what I'd say. You know, you look at your sources, look at your fact checking, think, do I need a right to reply? Caveat things, you know, we haven't gone to somebody else yet. Think about your contributor and what position they're in. What do they have if things went wrong? I think, yeah.
If you have time, can you talk more about honest opinion, please?
Honest opinion, yes. I mean, all I'll say is, honest opinion kind of is what it says on the tin. You have say you've got a new situation. Again, I'm not going to pick one out because I don't want to get into trouble. But if you have, that would be hilarious, wouldn't it? But I can't think of one right now. But if you have a situation that's going on, maybe it's a company that's done something, it's laid off lots of people, and you have a contributor that's saying about, you know, the effect on them. The facts, because it's got to be based on fact, right? The fact that they'll say, you know, I think it's terrible that XYZ company just has got rid of loads of staff and it doesn't care about its staff. That's honest opinion. It's got to be based on something that's happened. I mean, to give a really basic example, you know, if I went in the room and I said, you know, I think that person there, I think she's a fraudster, and she's unprofessional. I'm pointing at her because she's my mum. Sorry, but I knew I was a bit safe. But if I say that, yes, that's my opinion, I think. But what on earth is it based on? You know, what's it? But you can't, because I have sometimes a lot of people saying to me, yeah, but so-and-so said, I think. They said in the podcast, I think it's an opinion. We're allowed to do opinion. We're home dry. And you have to think about, well, no, but what's that based on? That's how rumours are, you know, the rumour mill. Well, I think so-and-so, I think so-and-so. And you have to make those facts clear in your programme as well, in your podcast.
Is it okay if somebody says, I think X, Y, Z, to then reply to them and say, okay, well, why do you think that? Do you have anything on a recording? Have a bit of, like, I guess, journalist integrity, and that's
Exactly.
in respect. But if they then say, actually, I don't have anything, this is just my opinion, is that then okay? Or are there maybe nicer ways in your experience of working in these places that maybe there's a nice way of doing that, or covering
Yeah.
your back where
Ex-
if it's a victim and you don't want to push them like
No,
that.
exactly. And again, that comes back again to, because honest opinion works quite a lot with truth. So it's and exactly as you say. So one is, people don't know. They've gone through something. They don't know what they have to say. But one is if you can get them to elaborate. And secondly, it's a bit of corroboration. So did something that they're saying happen? And if you can find that, you're on much safer ground. And again, what you said is absolutely key. Just having a bit of more responsibility, slight more objectivity, but also being sensitive as well, will save you quite a lot, basically, and really help with the meaning of it as well. So all these things kind of work together. I'm going on to privacy. We've touched on some of these things, but privacy, I think sometimes libel takes all this shine, but in the last few years, privacy has become really important. I'll say in podcasts that, I've done a lot of investigative journalism, advising on investigative journalism, and in some ways that's a bit easier because, yes, you might have secretly filmed somebody. If you are going to do that, by the way, take extreme legal advice. There's so many implications. I couldn't fit in. Never mind 1 hour, I couldn't fit in 10 hours, to be quite frank. But quite often you'll have a public interest argument. So all these things, what's private, what's considered private, again, no definitions. But generally speaking, this is common sense. Anything to do with your medical history, anything to do with your family life, even in a public place, if you were receiving medical treatment, let's say for an accident, it's in a public place, but it's still, you still expectation of privacy in that area. So if any of these things happen, you're even things like criminal matters sometimes, although you might have a public interest argument. But if you're touching on any of this, you're going to have an expectation of privacy, or if your contributors are touching on any of these things. With contributors, it's easy because they're consenting, they're talking voluntarily, probably about their private life. The difficulty comes sometimes when you or somebody else you're interviewing says something about a third party. So I'll give you an example that comes up so many times. They'll say, my uncle had depression or has depression, and straight away your sort of triggers should be on, because private information, yes, it's medical. It's not about your contributor, so they're not voluntarily speaking about it. Are you going to have a public interest argument to talk about someone's uncle? Unless they're very much in the public eye or there's some issue, it's going to be unlikely. So you're going to have to get the consent. So sometimes I say to people, did you get consent? Can you ask the contributor to just get the uncle to just give us a text message or send us something to say this is absolutely fine? Or they may have spoken about it before and it's in the public domain already, so you're not doing anything by including it. But these are the ways in which suddenly they happen. I tell you, this happens frequently, really, really frequently. Someone will reveal some private information and just have it in conversation. So in terms of so it's just, again, being a bit alive to, when I'm reading scripts, this is, or I've got to listen sometimes to recordings of podcasts, and this is a really frequent question. So one is often, have we fact-checked it? Have we sourced it? And people come back with 10, 20 sources just to keep me happy, and I'll be like, okay, it's fine, I get it. We can rely on truth. But the other one that comes up a lot, I can't tell you, is it private? If it's private about a third party, please get consent, unless you really think you've got a public interest argument to override it. Yes, exactly. You think about, put yourself in the situation, right? Someone revealed my private history without my consent, and I don't think there's any public interest reason.
I was just going to ask about consent, actually, particularly around when a guest decides they actually don't want you to air something.
Right.
Where do you stand with that? And I think there's a lot of podcasters who don't necessarily get people to sign consent forms for interview. Where do we stand with informed consent verbally? And what's the go with that?
I mean, obviously, I'm always going to say the best practice for informed consent is always going to be your lovely release form with your very descriptive description of what your podcast is. But I know real life and things don't always happen in that way. What I'd say with informed consent is, again, it's your whole relationship with that contributor. So informed consent you could demonstrate by emails you've had with them, by text messages you've had with them. Do they really understand what your podcast is about and what their contribution is as well? And if you're doing something that has a very long lead time, you know, it's you start it, but then it's going to be, I don't know, a good another 10, 12, maybe more months before it's actually going to be published. Has it changed? Like, always think about, has the original idea that you gave to that contributor about what the podcast is going to be, as I say, particularly with quite long kind of running podcasts, and they change, or you get it commissioned. So if you're doing it on your own, you'll know, but sometimes you get things commissioned and then someone will change it from the original idea. And you have to think, does that change? Does it maybe alter their consent? If I went back to them, would they think, actually, it's kind of not what I signed up for? So it's about always communicating with the changes. And also, I think with main contributors, it's one thing, but it's also your little guest, your other guest speakers as well. Do they have a really good idea of what the podcast is when you take it as a whole? So I think the best advice I can give is just with each contributor, get your release form, get it signed. If you can't, can you at least demonstrate through other communications you've had with them that the nature of the podcast, what it's covering, has been properly explained and communicated to them? And if it does change in tone or a lot, or it changes its subject areas, is that maybe something you also need to notify them about to change? And I think it's hard, what you're saying about if they want you to take something out. I mean, again, if legally, if they've given informed consent and if they've just changed their mind about something, legally you probably have quite a lot of rights to say, well, you can't just change your mind because you've given informed consent. But it does depend on the nature and the reason why they're doing it. I mean, some people will say, well, I've had a really big life change and actually this is perhaps isn't good for me at the moment to get this extra attention, and then it comes down to a bit of an ethical trust issue with you and your contributors. But yeah, it's always, I think the more you can demonstrate, like anything else, that your contributor knew exactly what was going on, the more leverage you have to say, well, you've given informed consent.
In fact, no, I'll reword that. Hypothetically, there are lots of conversations about trans people in the media, and obviously it's a much maligned topic in with the government and in the press. If you are interviewing a trans identifying or any kind of minority identifying participant in a interview, or you are talking about them and they're not participating, could you tell us, because obviously medical, financial information, if they are, if they're out but they're not talking about it, but you want to talk about them as a kind of, you want to argue public interest, but because it's being talked about as a national conversation, but the national conversation might not be about that person specifically. Yeah. Could you touch on that, please?
Yeah. I mean, just again, I'm going to be a very brief thing because there's so many factors. Really briefly, it's also got to be proportionate. So the subject matter may be of public interest, but again, you've got to justify why speaking about that individual, particularly if they've not spoken about certain things before in the public domain, why speaking and identifying this particular person would be in the public interest. So it's a proportionality, is what I'd say, very briefly. Contempt of court. This is a bit of a one. Basically, contempt of court, and it's a very UK specific issue, although I think it does sometimes apply in other territories as well. But if you compare it to the US, we're completely different in how. So the idea of contempt of court really is that anything you're producing or anything that you make and broadcast shouldn't really be interfering with an ongoing trial. So that's the basic idea, an ongoing criminal trial. Easiest piece of advice really is wait until the trial is finished, and then you can, and that's also helpful for libel, by the way, because, you know, once someone's got a conviction, if you're talking about that person or that case, then you've got truth kind of already. So that's why it's very helpful, but also contempt of court, yeah, ultimately you wait until a trial has finished, and then you can talk about that specific case. Hi.
On the libel front, right, let's say someone's been convicted of something, and then you report on that, right, and then they appeal their conviction and it gets overturned. Do you have a right, do you have the responsibility to go back and correct that?
That's a really good question. I think that's why you should timestamp things, and it kind of depends, because some appeals might happen years and years after. You know, it's a slow system, but I think it depends. I mean, that's why I say to sometimes try and have like a time frame of when something happened. But if you are then publishing or talking about something and you know an appeal is happening, say you then know, I would just say, for factual kind of accuracy as well, the appeal is taking place. But the current status is, until it's appealed, the conviction stands.
It stands, okay.
So you know, it's perhaps more of a factual accuracy. And for libel purposes, again, it stands. They're convicted until it gets overturned.
Okay. And in regards to public interest, I'm just thinking back, it wasn't podcasting as such, it was a case, Naomi Campbell and the press.
Yeah.
So they basically leaked something, and they said that it was public interest, but then it breached her private, or it wasn't her privacy specifically, it was the people who was photoed in it.
Photoed, yes.
And do we run the risk with getting into those situations with podcasting too?
Well, it's good, but the thing is that with that case, it was the photo that was a breach of privacy. So her coming out of the centre was a breach of her privacy, because, you know, it pertained to her medical info. But when it came to libel, which is where the crossover is, so sometimes you can be home dry on a libel front, but there might be a privacy issue, which is exactly what happened in that case. So yeah, it does happen in podcasting, as I say, because you always have to think, and I'll do this in a moment, a checklist. Okay, it's not libelous because it's true, but even if it's true, does it engage privacy? And if it does engage issues around privacy, then you'll be having this conversation.
Okay,
I'm being waved at. So yeah, you're all, and I'm going to do a checklist about that as well. But this is the crossover. You know, quite often, and we've had recent cases about people suing. Triple whammy. They're suing you for libel. They're suing you for privacy. They're suing you for copyright infringement. You know, so always think about that. Am I home dry on every single one of these? But yeah, so again, this happens a lot. So you'll interview someone, not contempt of court, but I'd say my last point. If you are interviewing somebody and it's the first time, perhaps, that they're talking about maybe being a victim of modern slavery, FGM, forced marriage, or a victim of or complainant of a sexual offence, really they get automatic anonymity in UK law. So if you're interviewing them, you really have to get them to waive that anonymity, or to recognise the fact that by going on this podcast, that automatic anonymity they got in law is now waived. It sounds obvious, but it's just always something to check again. And this comes down to, I think, contributor care. I'm just going to quickly go on to that, but you know, whoever it is that you've got on your podcasts, it's sort of thinking what stage they're at. You know, if it's the first time they've revealed something, are they really robust enough? This isn't a legal requirement, by the way. I work, as I said, a lot in TV, where the broadcasting regulations now are much more prescriptive about welfare of contributors. It's not always like that on the content that you'll necessarily work on, but I think it's really important how you deal with your contributors, and whether it's really right for them at that stage to talk about certain issues, whether they're kind of sound, because they will get attention. There is often, there could be press around it. I know there are different types of podcasts, and not everyone is doing big podcasts. It's to, you know, small communities, but they're just as good. But I just think it's always good as thinking about the impact on your contributor. How robust are they? The more difficult subjects you're doing, you know, really have they got enough maybe evidence that they can use? Are they very reliable? Are they robust enough to kind of deal with these things? Because they can have repercussions. Hi. Yes, I do here.
Sorry, what does the final bullet mean? Anonymity, speaking the same language.
So I think this comes down to the fact that I mean, when I first came to just the media sort of landscape, we all use a lot of technical terms, and I think one of the things that used to happen is people would talk about things like pitch shifting, or, you know, anonymization techniques, and even for me, I don't know what they mean. So sometimes what happens is your contributors don't always know. So if you've got a contributor on your podcast and you said and they want to contribute, but they want to kind of remain anonymous, it's just talking to them about what that means. So it's even, I had that in, libel, which I didn't talk about, so thanks for reminding me, but the difference between identified and identifiable. So you might not name them, you might not refer to them by name, you might disguise their voice a little bit, but that doesn't mean that nobody ever would be able to identify them, because people, particularly people you know very well, can identify you very easily. Just being aware of the guarantees that you give to contributors. So yeah, anonymity, are we speaking the same language? Do they understand? Because when I thought about voice disguising, I was thinking about, you know, the Darth Vader type voice disguising. So when I had people, producers, telling me, don't worry, they're going to be disguised, I was thinking, wow, yeah, that's great. And then actually, I know that sounds rubbish. Some people do it for effect, but that sounds rubbish. So then they talk about pitch shifting. So then I said, well, what is pitch shifting? And if I don't know, and I've been working a bit in this industry, just make sure your contributor knows, because when they listen to it, they may think, hold on a second, I thought when they said they were disguising my voice, I thought they were really going to town on it. But actually, I don't think that's disguising my voice at all. So I'm just, again, it's this sort of contributor care, particularly people who don't know. Just make sure they know and understand.
I just had a thought when you were saying about that. Isn't there also a danger, like, I mean, obviously not to go into like the rabbit hole here, but like, there's also the thing about anonymity, to be also careful, like if the person uses a certain place, that it cannot also not be misconstrued as someone else, and they get misidentified.
Exactly.
So where all of a sudden it's someone else, where all the paparazzi or the neighbors are at their door, or, you know, whatever.
Exactly.
Yeah. So it's that. So it's a whole territory of its own, isn't it?
Exactly. Yeah. Which is why that rabbit hole in 2 minutes we can't go down. But I completely understand, and I exactly why we end up having so many conversations about this. It's like, well, we don't also want to mistakenly identify someone else. But here's a really quick checklist. Do I have two minutes? Yeah. So really quick checklist, which is, you know, first one, you know, easy. You've got all your correct releases from your contributors. You've got all your third-party consents and clearances, unless you think you can rely on fair dealing, which we talked about. You've got informed consent. You've considered any related welfare issues. Content's not defamatory, or if it is, you can rely on truth, justification, fair comment. You're not covering any active criminal proceedings, so it's active. So from arrest to you know, the trial, basically, that might raise contempt issues. It doesn't infringe any privacy, as we've spoken about, unless you're certain that the matters are already in the public. You've got consent, that should say as well, and or you've got a public interest argument that can override it. And yeah, of course, always check in with your lawyer or legal team if you need to. But really, as I said, because I know not some of you are doing podcasts, and I really admire you a lot. I listen a lot to podcasts, but you're doing podcasts all on your own. And so I have to say, this is really just a bit of a guide so that you know where you're going. And don't be. My last point to say is, do not be intimidated at all by the law. Or by lawyers. having worked in this industry a long time, you know, do talk, don't just take everybody's word for it. There are different opinions. Another end disclaimer, so there'll be another lawyer watching this thinking, I wouldn't have said that, but I have been doing this for a while, so I think I've got a good idea. But as I say, just always, it's your content, your contributors, your reputation. So, you know, make sure you always question as well advice that you're getting.